Now I want to request Daniel to
All
present.
right. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I want to mention that 3 or 4 years ago, I spent quite a bit of time in the library here, looking at this. You know, we're started again about 1944, and so I photocopied over a period of time a lot of those records, and they've been in a box in my apartment in Denver for 25 years. So last year I said, okay, there'd come a time when I'm not going to be here, and what about these records? So I decided to take excerpts. Excerpts means portions. Some of the documents were 8 or 10 pages long. I didn't copy all that. I read through, and what I thought was interesting, I copied. Now, I'm not an academic, and I realize that if you're an academic, you have to put footnotes. Well, I wasn't going to put 350 footnotes in this book, and secondly, I didn't take the time, to write down all the details. But I have copies of these documents at my home. So if somebody says, "Oh, is that right?" then I can scan and send the document to. In other words, I didn't make any of this up. Now, the other thing about this is, all of you know what italics are, right? Italic, and the text that's in italics are actual quotes from the records. And the text that is not in italics are my comments. Now, as you know, the British have been in Nepal for 200 years or more. But very few Americans, came to Nepal. And so the first chapter, I talk about what I could find about Americans that actually came to Nepal. Now that was my research. Maybe I've missed some people, I don't know. But anyway, what I could find, I put in here in the first chapter, and there were very few. Then the second chapter then is based again on most of these State Department records. Now this is the American perspective. So how did these records originate? So at that time there was an American office in New Delhi, under the British Raj, and of course in 47 then there was an embassy in New Delhi. So the diplomats there were reading the Indian newspapers, and so they would take material from the Indian newspapers. Now we all know even today that you cannot believe everything that's in the newspapers, and especially in here it's pretty clear to me that a lot of what was printed in the Indian papers was based on what the Indian ambassador here in Kathmandu was telling the papers, what some people in West Bengal, that were very sympathetic to the Congress, were telling the newspapers. And so, again, some of it was accurate, some of it may not have been accurate. The second source was that when these Americans came to Kathmandu, and there were 5 or 6 different missions that I talk about in here. And when they came up here, they talked to the Prime Minister, Jutta Shamsher, Padma Shamsher, Bowen Shamsher, Vijaya Shamsher, and they made notes of what they were told and what they saw in Kathmandu. And they wrote these reports, and they sent them back to Washington. And those are the records, that I pulled out 25 years ago. The third source was that in New Delhi, Nehru and Nehru's advisors, Bajpai was one man, he would come to the American ambassador and say, here's what Nehru's thinking, here's India's point of view, etc. So that was written down and sent to Washington. Now that I believe, because the U.S. ambassador in India had no reason to lie, to make things up, right? He's reporting to his boss, who's the Secretary of State. Secretary of State reports to the President. So again, now sometimes, of course, they're giving their opinions, what they think is what they think. But the basic records in here, I believe, 99.9%. Now, but I emphasize this is only a partial perspective. What about the British? The British embassy here, they were involved, of course, at the end of the Rana period and the revolution. They must have had records, cables. I suppose those are in London somewhere. The British records until 1947, I think, are in New Delhi. But I've not gone down there to look. Then you have the Indian records. And I question, if any of you, this is a question I would have for Nepali historians. In New Delhi, I know that Nehru's speeches are available. I know that Nehru's letters are available. What I want to know is, when Nehru met King Dhruvan, is the record of that conversation available? I tend to doubt it, but I don't know. In other words, cabinet meetings, when the Ministry of External Affairs was briefing Nehru about what's going on in Nepal, are those records available? I don't know. Now we look at Nepal. I've spent a lot of time at the National Archives here. And in the National Archives, you have Lal Moors, you have Sanat Sawals, you have Ekchapi, Duichapi records going way back, which is interesting. But I don't know that there are any records, at least I haven't seen, again, that talk about when Mohan Shamsher was Prime Minister and he's talking with the other Ranas, what's going on, what is their ideas, what's happening. Where are those records? Do they even exist? The Foreign Ministry, they may have records relating to dealing with India at this time. Again, maybe they're there, maybe they're not. But the nice thing about America is these records have been declassified. Now there's 2 or 3 that were classified. And the reason was that if somebody in Calcutta told the American embassy something, right, they didn't want that person's name to go out publicly. So they've classified that. But other than that, all these records are declassified. All right, so I hope that explains the background for this book. And I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the other books. And I have copies here if any of you are interested. But my main point is that I know nothing in English like this has been printed, because I have all the books on Nepali history, right, in English. The best book for that period of time is Leo Rose and Bhubanlal Joshi's Democratic Innovations in Nepal. That was published in 1966. And that gives an account of the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, the King, and so on. Sort of the political history of Nepal, which is good. But this really gives a lot of the inside, what people are saying, what people are doing, about the different different political parties and so on. And of course the Congress Party in India, etc. So now in Nepali, I don't know how much of this is known. I don't know the sources. My guess is that the sources for a lot of Nepali history is what people told, people that were living at that time. Like B.P. Corral, he wrote his memoirs. But of course, B.P. Corral's memoirs give you a very good account of B.P. Corral, right? That's what people do, they write their memoirs. So whether this kind of material is available in Nepali books, I don't know. I can't read Nepali well enough to know. But I still think there's a lot of new information here. But it's, again, a partial perspective. Okay. So here I am, 56 years ago in Sunol Bazar, Daring district. And I went there, as I say, as an American Peace Corps volunteer. And this is on the back cover of one of my books. Now there are still some of these students that I'm still in touch with. One's in America. Vishnu Pukar Shrestha is now ambassador to China. I taught him in 8th class. So, all right. You've already had my introduction, so I'll skip this. But just to say that I retired in 2009 from the U.S. government, and I've come to Nepal every year except the COVID year. And I come and I travel around, I do research, I meet my friends, and then I might mention the books. Okay, now here's the cover. Now this cover photo, again, I prepared this in the States, right? And I wanted it published in Nepal because I don't want to bring books from America. And if anybody's interested, it'll be mostly here in Nepal, not so much in America. So the printer left out the description of this photo, but it was taken in December 1948 by one of the Americans who came to Kathmandu, and he's taking it from Dara, right? You can see Swayambhu there, and Basapur and so on. So that's the cover. So now we're going, and now I prepared a text before I left America a month ago because I don't have photographic memory. And so I knew if I just talked off the top of my head, I'd leave out a lot of things. Some of the material is here. I know that you know. But I wrote this really for a foreign audience too. I hope to give a presentation before some Americans who don't know much about Nepali history. Well, I read some of this, and then later I'll talk. This is only for this book. So the first American to reach Nepal, as far as I know. Now it's possible that some American came and met Jung Bahadur, but I have not found any record of that. Was named Henry Valentine. And he'd worked for the State Department in Bombay. And he and his 13-year-old son were invited by the British resident to come to Kathmandu. Now he got to Chisapanigari, and he did not have an official Nepali document, right? So he had to force his way through, and he came to Kathmandu in November 1885. And he met Ranadip Singh. And 1 week later, Ranadip Singh was killed by his Shamsher Rana nephews. Now this man, his name is Frank Buck, and he was from Texas. And he was world famous as a capturer of wild animals. He would go to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to India, and he tried to catch animals to take back to America for the zoos in America. So in 1920, and he wrote a book called Bring 'Em Back Alive in 1930, where he describes his trips. And he said one of the most interesting experiences he had was capturing 2 baby rhinos in Nepal. Now, actually the book says he did not come in and capture it himself. He met Kaisar Shamsher, and Kaisar Shamsher went into the Tarai with 100 Nepalis and 20 elephants to capture these 2 rhinos. And they put them in some kind of wooden cage. And then Buck came up to the Tarai and took that cage down to Roxall, and from Roxall it went to Calcutta by rail, and from Calcutta it went all the way to San Francisco by ship. And those 2 rhinos, one went to the Philadelphia Zoo and one went to the Bronx Zoo in New York. And he had to pay Chandra Shamsher $35,000. He had to pay Chandra Shamsher $35,000 for those 2 rhinos. Now this man, Alexander Powell, he was a war correspondent and a world traveler. And he was perhaps the first ugly American. I don't know if you've read the book Ugly American, but you know what that means. He was in Calcutta and he managed to meet Prime Minister Chandra. And he got permission to come up to Nepal. And this was in February 1928. His book contained extremely critical passages about Hinduism, its naked holy men, and Buddhist lamas who had bad body odor and needed to bathe. He did praise the strength and endurance of Nepali porters, but the Ranas were very upset, when they read what this man had written about Nepal. He also said, nothing to see in Nepal except, I think, the Darbar Square in Batan or Bhaktapur. That's the only thing. Otherwise, why come to Nepal? Anyway, this book is, it's available in reprint. But, all right, this man is Dr. Charles Blanchard from Youngstown, Ohio. And he and his wife were the first Americans that I know of that were actually invited by the Nepal government to come to Nepal. This was 1929. He was a proctologist, an internationally known authority on rectal problems. That means hemorrhoids, colon cancer, that sort of thing. And he had been lecturing in London. He reached Kathmandu in February 1929. Now it is said that Chandra Shamsher died of tuberculosis. But I wonder if he was suffering from colon cancer, because why would he have called a doctor like this to come? And he died 9 months after this doctor treated him or looked at him. Now he wrote a long article in which he described Chandra as, quote, a dictator with velvet gloves, a composite mixture of intellect, shrewdness, justness, kindness, and sternness. He had a charming smile and is loved and at the same time feared by his subjects, end of quote. And while here, Dr. Blanchard also conducted a seminar at Beer Hospital. And at that time, most of the doctors were Bengalis. Now, this is from an article in an American newspaper in 1935. And you see, in America, well, was Nepal part of India or was it an independent country? There was some confusion. A lot of people didn't know about Nepal, never heard of Nepal. But what this shows is that the Rana palaces, outside they look like the European palaces, right? But inside, they wanted American furniture. They wanted the latest. So what they did was, they wrote to Sears and Roebuck Company in Chicago, Illinois, and said, will you please design some of our rooms? And so you see here that, oops, I'm sorry. Let me And so here, this is the one I want. Here's a sofa, here's lamps, here's tables. And and it wasn't just, Judah Shamsher, it was, he had a list of 5 or 6 Ranas, that had ordered furniture from America. And of course it came, all the way to Calcutta, and then came up to Roxall, and then on the railway up to Amlagunj, and so on and so forth. So what the paper said was, it's easier for an American table to come into Nepal than for an American citizen. So it's possible that some Sears Roebuck salesmen came into Nepal to take these orders. But of course, they might have been Indians, who were representing Sears and Roebuck in India. Now, so that covers, pre-World War II. Now, during the war, the Americans had offices in India, and they were remember they were fighting the Japanese, along with Britain and other countries, the Allied forces. And they were sending, from America, they were sending a lot of material, weapons as well as other materials to supply India, because India too, was fighting the Japanese in Burma and Thailand and Singapore and so on. So, the Allies needed certain minerals to build tanks, planes, bombs, etc., strategic minerals, and these are still used today. And so Nepal heard about this, and so they wrote to the Americans in India saying, maybe we have some minerals here in Nepal that would be useful, that we could sell to India to help in the war. Of course, Nepal was supplying Gurkha soldiers, right? But now they're thinking maybe we can sell some minerals. So this man, Andrew Corey, he came up to Nepal. And Corey, he was a young Montana geologist working in India. And in November 1944, he was invited to Nepal to check the mineral supplies here. He was a junior civil servant. He was, 25, 30 years old. Not a diplomat, but a geologist. All right, but when he came to Kathmandu, he had a meeting with Judah Shamsher, and he took notes. What did Judah Shamsher say? Now, of course, Corey had no power to make promises or to say. All he said was, "I will send what you're telling me. I will make a report and send it to Washington." Then he met with Commander-in-Chief Padma Shamsher and other high officials, and he wrote a report for the U.S. State Department, noting what he was told. So I quote from his report about what he was told and what he saw in Nepal. Now, of course, Judah resigned the prime ministership in 1945 and then was succeeded by Padma Shamsher. Now, this is the Nepali official who was writing to the Americans in India was Khadka Narsingh Rana. He had gotten a degree in chemistry from Bombay. In 1941, the Bureau of Mines was set up, the Nepal Bureau of Mines, and he was the head of the Bureau of Mines. So he was the one that the Prime Minister and so on said, you write to the Americans and invite them up and have them look for minerals. So he met with all the officials that came up here through 1949. By the way, his son is in Maharajganj, and I went there and met him the other day, and he got a copy of my book. Naturally, right? All right. Now, the next year, 1945, this man, Harry Witt, and he also was from Houston, Texas, and he was based in New Delhi, again with a branch of the American government. And he reached Kathmandu in September 1945. Now you see, by that time, the war, I believe, was over, because I think in April, I think Germany surrendered, and of course the atomic bombs were dropped in August, so he came just as the World War II was over. But he was asked by Nepal if the U.S. would help industrialize Nepal and help them engage in world trade. So he met with Prime Minister Judah and Commander-in-Chief Mohan, and also Mohan's son Vijaya Shamsher, who was chairman of the Nepal's Development Board. So, and then Witt made a 1-month trek from Kathmandu up to Nuwakot, Arugat, Lumjung, Pokhara, and then down Tansen and Bhutol. And when the British ambassador heard of this, he was furious, because the British had never been able to get permission to go there, and he wanted the Prime Minister to bring him back, but that didn't happen. All right, so the other interesting thing is that this man Witt had a movie camera, 8mm camera, and he made 2 films when he was here, 1945. If we have time, I could show you one. The quality's not so good, right? I mean, in those days, nothing was automatic, but still, how many films from Nepal 1945 have you seen? All right, here's Vijaya Shamsher, and he was younger and much more forward-looking than many of the Ranas, and he'd studied in Calcutta, and he knew English, and he knew what was going on outside Nepal. And the Americans who came and met him were very impressed by his attitude and his abilities. And he gave Witt a list of 15 development projects that he said were under consideration by the government. I have that list in here. I don't know, I know that in Nepali books they talk about Vijaya Shamsher and they had these plans, but do they have this list of what actually they were thinking of doing? In 1945. Now, of course, that didn't happen for a number of reasons, which you will find out if you read the book, but at least they had the idea. So while these projects that Vijaya Shamsher was talking about in 1945, they were not implemented before the fall of the Ranas in 1951, it does demonstrate that some efforts to plan development had been made in the latter half of the 1940s in Nepal. All right, this is George Merrill. He was the next American visitor. He was the highest ranking diplomat in India, and he met Padma Shamsher, who's there on the right, in November 1945 and negotiated an agreement of commerce and friendship with Nepal. Again, the excerpts from his reports on his meetings and what his mission saw in Nepal, they're in this book. Then Joseph Satterthwaite. He was personally appointed by President Truman to lead a delegation to Kathmandu to negotiate and sign an executive agreement that established diplomatic relations between Nepal and the United States. This agreement was signed April 25th, 1947, 75 years ago. So the United States was the second nation, after Great Britain, of course, to establish diplomatic relations with Nepal and recognize Nepal's sovereignty and independence. The U.S. ambassador to India was also designated as the minister to Nepal. But the U.S. embassy was not opened until 1959 in Nepal. We had no embassy in Kathmandu until 1959. Now, of course, this was an earlier photo of King Tribhuwan and Merrill and Satterthwaite and the other Americans that came. They were introduced to him at formal ceremonies. But as you probably know, the king was strictly a ceremonial figure. He was recognized as the head of the state, so they addressed him, as the head of state. But he exercised no authority, as the Ranas kept a close guard over him and did not allow him to talk to foreigners or even with the ordinary people of Nepal. However, he was secretly in touch with and supported supported efforts by Nepalis in India to oust the Ranas and restore the powers of the Shah monarchs. Now, there's lots of information too in here. At this time, we're up to 1948, 49 of the Nepali Congress organizing in India. And the embassy got various leaflets, pamphlets about what the Congress Party was doing in India. So, that's in here as well. So, again, I don't need to tell you about Ganesh Man Singh. But he'd been imprisoned for anti-Rana activities, and then he was a leader of the forces in India. He lived to be a leading figure in the 1989-1990 Janta Andolan for people's movement that led to King Birendra surrendering much of his power to a democratically elected government. And he died in 1997. Have any of you met Ganesh Man Singh? All right, I didn't, right? I wasn't that interested. If I'd been interested, at that time, I would have tried to meet him. All right, here's Kesar Shamsher. Now, he was a son, of course, of Chandra Shamsher, and he amassed the biggest private collection of books in Nepal. And that library, how many of you have gone to that library? All right.
Yeah.
But I understand it's closed because of the earthquake, right? And I don't know they're going to repair the building or what. And the Garden of Dreams is there. And that of course, is part of Kesar Mahal. Now Kaiser held many positions in the Rana government, including the ambassador to the UK. So here he is with his second wife and daughter in Washington, D.C. in February 1948. where he presented his credentials as Nepal's minister to the United States. Now, Nepal didn't have an embassy in America then either. So they went back to London. They had an embassy in London. Now, I was told last year that this little girl is still alive and living in Kathmandu. So she's one of two people in this book that's still alive. One is this woman and one is Gyanendra. Now we go to Henry Grady. He was U.S. ambassador to India, and he came to Nepal and met Mohan Shamsher in May 1948. And some members of his mission wrote very interesting reports about what they saw and learned during their short visit to Nepal. They noted that the dominant fact about Nepal was its isolation, so that any general State Department involvement in Nepal would be premature. And of course, this was before a U.S. foreign aid program had been established to assist the developing and newly independent countries in Asia and Africa. See, the Ranas were hoping, for U.S. help, but we had no foreign aid program. After World War II, 1947, the Marshall Plan, that was to rebuild Germany. There was no program to help, develop the so-called developing countries. All right, we have to keep. All right, now Lloyd Henderson, he was one of the most distinguished of all U.S. diplomats, and he came to Kathmandu on an official mission in December 1948, and he also met Prime Minister Mohan Shamsher. Unfortunately, his report sent to the State Department I was unable to locate. Remember, I said one box they couldn't find 25 years ago. Maybe they found it, but now I don't live in Washington, so. All right, but a few photographs of his trip are held by Georgetown University. So here he is arriving at Hanumandoka Palace. And here he's inside the Gati Bertak, is that what it's called? In Basanpur. And you see here's King Tribhuvan, and here's Mohan Shamsher, here's Henderson, and here are the other Ranas. And notice here's Janga Bahadur. This is probably Queen Victoria. I don't know if these pictures still are there or not. And you see here's Henderson reading his speech to the king, not to Mohan Shamsher, because the king is the head of state. And then after his speech, you see here, oops, I'm sorry. What's going on over here? Here he's reading. After his speech, here's King Tribhuvan, and he's introducing the members of his delegation. And probably they said, nice to meet you or something. But again, they didn't have any kind of substantive talks with the king. Am I missing something here? Okay, I guess not. All right, now this man is Dillon Ripley, and he was an ornithologist and a professor of zoology with Yale University and the Smithsonian. And he got permission to travel to parts of western and eastern Nepal in late 1948 to collect birds. And some of those birds are still in the Smithsonian Institute. Now, we know how essential Sherpa guides have been for mountaineering expeditions. But the same with the scientific expeditions by foreigners. You see, this man, he was the guide for Ripley. He was from the western part of Nepal. He knew the jungles. He knew where the birds were. He knew the trails. And you'll notice here he's got an old British rifle, and he's got the kukri, and of course, no shoes. All right, and then Ripley wrote this book, A Search for the Spiny Valor. It was published in 1952. It's still available in reprint editions. All right, this man is Carl Taylor, and he was born in India, and he conducted the first health survey in Nepal in 1949. And I include sections of his report in the book to illustrate the woeful state of healthcare facilities, the lack of medicines, the numerous diseases from which Nepalis in the Terai and the hill areas suffered only 75 years ago. Now this, of course, was taken later on, in his life, but he became a famous expert on international health.
His article is also published in one of the journals, right?
All right, and he was at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Carl Taylor. All right, well, I don't have to tell you about Subarna Shamsher. And of course, because of the practice of multiple wives and mistresses, the Rana's male population had exploded, and those born of women of lower caste had been deprived of their right to hold high office by Juta Shamsher in 1932. So Subarna lived in Calcutta. He was a wealthy businessman, and he funded a lot of those who wanted to overthrow the Ranas. And in 1951, he became Minister of Finance in the Nepal government, And in 1959, the Congress government, he was also Minister of Finance, but when King Mahendra dissolved the government and arrested many of its officials, he again went to Calcutta, where he lived until he died. And here's Dr. K.I. Singh. He was another leader of the anti-Rana forces. He led a ragtag group of fighters in the Western Terai in 1950, refused to lay down his arms when Nepali Congress leaders told him to do so. He was arrested, jailed in Kathmandu, escaped, went to China, where he lived for a few years, and he returned as a hero and is appointed prime minister for a brief time by King Mahendra. So his motives, beliefs, and ideology remain a mystery, at least to me. Again, there's more information on all these people, in the book. All right, so 1950, as you all know, Tribhuvan left the palace, went to the Indian embassy to seek asylum, and so the Ranas said, okay, he's vacated the throne, he's no longer the king. So they crowned King Gyanendra, 3 years old, as the king. But nobody outside Nepal recognized Gyanendra as the king. And Tribhuvan soon regained the throne thanks to a deal brokered by India's Prime Minister Nehru. But this man is unique in world history. Why? Because he became king twice. Once in 1950, and then once in 2001 when his brother King Birendra was assassinated. So he's a unique figure in world history. And here's Loy Henderson in Delhi, and with Prime Minister Nehru and Nehru's sister Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. Now, the Indian government was intimately involved with developments in Nepal in 1950-51, and of course later on, maybe even today, right? And Nehru's advisors briefed the U.S. ambassador in New Delhi what the Indians were saying and thinking about Nepal. I mention again, I don't know whether those Indian documents have been declassified and made available or not. But at least in this book, there is some record of what the Indian officials were telling the U.S. ambassador about at that time. And the reports he made to the State Department in Washington clearly reveal the extent to which Nehru and the Indian government were deeply involved in the internal affairs of Nepal. All right, so here's February 1951, and from the left is this is the Indian ambassador, C.P.N. Sinha, and King Tribhuvan, and Mohan Shamsher, and they were getting on a plane, to come back to Nepal. So thanks to Nehru, the king returned to Nepal to reclaim his position. Now, when I first came to Nepal, in the 1960s, that day in February was considered Democracy Day. Now, I don't know whether, in other words, the birth of democracy was considered that February, whatever it was, in 1951.
February 18th.
Now, today, I don't know, right? Because after what happened after 1951, so I don't know now if democracy's day is 1989, 1990. Is this day still celebrated?
It's partially celebrated.
Partially,
yes.
Okay. Anyway,
it's recognized as a democracy day,
Yeah.
basically.
But anyway, I say it's a unique revolution. Why? Because the king before the revolution was the king after the revolution.
Yeah.
And the prime minister before the revolution, Mohan Shamsher, was the prime minister after the revolution. So it's a very strange kind of revolution. But of course the Ranas, they lost their monopoly on the government. So there was some change. All right, and so there's Mohan Shamsher, King Tribhuvan, and B.P. Corella in 1951. Now this is Chester Bowles. He was American ambassador in 1952. He's on the old trail from Bhimfedi to Tanhod to present his credentials to King Tribhuvan. And as you know, the Rajpat did not open until 1956. And again, I could not find his records of his visit here to Nepal. So my book ends in 1952 because I had so many to do, right? And I wasn't going to do a 800 or 900 page book, and I was mainly interested on this particular period. Now, of course, Bowles in 1952, he could have flown to Kathmandu. Why he came this way, whether he wanted to prove his toughness, his machismo, I don't know. But anyway, there he is on a horse, coming up from Bhimfedi. All right, so anyway, this book then contains excerpts from the U.S. State Department cables and reports dating from 1944 to 1952, and they give an inside view from the American perspective of the situation in Nepal, the challenges the country faced, and some of the important players, Nepalese, Indian, British, and Americans, who all had a role in the political and economic issues of that time. So there's a great deal of raw information here. And after digesting it, the readers can come to their own conclusions. For the study of history is an evolving process that can give rise to many different interpretations. All right, so here's a book I did a couple of years ago. I have a copy. All right, I want to read all that. There was an American mining engineer, Gilbert Richardson. He came to Nepal about 1959, and he took some black and white photos, mostly in Kathmandu. And his son gave me those photos, and they are, they're reproduced in this book. And for example, here's one of the photos. So these are more than 60-year-old photographs. And people tell me, oh, well, on the internet there's so many photos. I say, yeah, but not these photos, right? Not the photos not the photos I published. And of course, the other thing in this book, I have 10 chapter headings: ethnic groups, religion, work, travel, etc. And in the front, I quote from Nepali authors, documents, newspaper reports at this time. So you get a sense of what was Nepal like 50, 60 years ago. Here, Tamang children, northern Daring district. I went up there, at that time I was up there, the Americans were landing on the moon. So you talk about a contrast, right? Now I have this, recording, Tara Devi. I used to hear Tara Devi on Radio Nepal. Now there was a rock festival in Kathmandu in 1973. Some foreign bands, but also Nepali bands. So I don't know whether anybody here, you're all too young to have attended that. But this shows again the influence of Western culture, in the 70s. The hippies, about whom I don't care much for the hippies, right? That's a whole other discussion. Here's in Janipur area, where they decorate their houses, paint their houses on the outside. All right, this was the first tourist book. Really, tourism started in Nepal in 1956 when King Mahendra was coronated. And so here's a book that I have that was published in 1956 for the tourists that came up, to see the coronation of King Mahendra. And this is Baitari. So you see one of the things about Nepal that even today amazes me is the variety, right? The variety, not just in ethnic groups and languages, but houses. You won't see a house like this in Kapri Palachok or wherever. So one thing I didn't mention, of the 77 districts in Nepal, I've been through 73. So sometimes briefly, but anyway. And I like to go in and take photos. All right, here's Tukshay. Have any of you been to Tukshay? Now, of course, there's a road there, but when I went there in 1974, so I had trucked from Pokhara to Jomsom. And of course, the helicopter, it can land anywhere in Nepal, right? Cornfield, as long as there's not a tree overhead or telephone wires, it can land. And of course, this is the daily life of so many Nepalis, even today, right? Walking. And now it's on the buses. When I traveled, how many thousands and thousands of Nepalis are riding buses every day? I don't know, 10% of the population, 5% of the population, a tremendous number. Well, back here, there weren't very many roads, so people were walking. And this I took in Daring, women getting the water, making a doko. All right, so then I did a short book on green energy, transportation, right? That's the in thing now, green energy. There was a Kathmandu Bhaktapur trolley bus. How many of you rode that? All right, well. And of course, so the story of that bus service, which the Chinese government built, and it started in 1976. And I took this photo in Bhaktapur, 1975. That story is I told in that monograph. Then I did a book on railways in Nepal, and I was telling Harshaman, it's 325 pages, a lot of color photos. It's very expensive, very heavy, so I can't really sell it here in Nepal. It's hard to bring it here. And again, if I sell 100 copies in my life, I'll be happy, right? Because it's very specialized. But I worked 8 years, when I'd come here, every year I would do research. National Archives, I'd interview people. So let me just briefly, the first railways were in the Terai, and they were built by Indian contractors to cut the sal trees, to take the wood to India for the sleepers. We say ties in America, the sleepers are under the rails. So this is probably, this is not dated, but it's probably the early 1920s. And there was one in Bardhiya district, Kailali district, one in Chitwan district, and they were only there for 3 or 4 years. They'd go in, they'd cut the trees, then they'd move the track somewhere else. Here's the Nepal government railway from Raksal to Amliganj. This was taken by a British. You see, I contacted people in the UK. They came to Nepal, the rail fans, and
Steam engine?
yeah, these are all steam engines, and they were built. Some were built in the UK, 2 were built in Germany, and 1 was built in Belgium. So this was 1958. Now, once the Rajput opened, of course, the railway was finished, and of course, the government didn't keep it up. You know, it was built in 1927. It opened in 1927. So by 1960,
26 or 27?
pardon, 2027 was when it was dedicated. So. Now, there was a railroad from Dharan to the Kosi Barrage called the Kosi Project Railway, and that was built by the Indians about 1960. Nepal had nothing to do with it. The Indians came, they put the tracks, they brought the engines, and this too was taken by a Brit. You know, I was here at that time, but I wasn't thinking about railways. Right now, it's very hard to find any evidence of this railway. Now here's the Janipur-Jayanagar Railway. So you can see people were riding on the roof, people riding on the engine without tickets. And this is a very nice, this is a nice photo. All right, is that the end of my? Okay, I guess that's the end of my presentation. So now I have copies of this. It's 1,000 rupees, which I know there's some available for 500, but you know, I put a lot of time and effort in here. And if you're interested in a copy, and also this copy on the Bhaktapur bus, and those I have a couple of copies, but there's not a great crowd here, so maybe, but it's up to you. Now, I'll be here after I leave in December. Then they'll be available probably from Ratnasagar Prakashan in Delhi Bazaar. They're the ones that